Hi everyone. Yes, my name is Sorcha Kirker and I'm the current Vice President for Higher Education with the Highlands and Islands Students Association. William has obviously mentioned enhancement themes, and a big part of my work this year has been looking at student interaction with data and how we can engage them more. Today the types of things that I'll be discussing will be what are the kinds of data that we interact with and why, what kinds of problems do we face with these data sets, what are the barriers that we face in relation to student engagement and interaction with those, and more importantly, what are the benefits of student involvement in these processes. And then at the end, I'm going to go through a case study, which was an event that I helped to run this year, the House of Student Rep Summit, and a lot of our sessions were designed to try and engage the student reps with our data processes here at the University of the Highlands and Islands. So from my perspective as a sabbatical officer, the kinds of data that Students Association officers and student reps are most likely to interact with are key performance indicators, social media data is quite important, survey results. I've interacted quite a lot with the NSS data this year, and also student-led teaching awards, student rep data and feedback data. These are probably more at the level of being a sabbatical officer. Student reps wouldn't usually interact so much with things like KPIs. So it's just a snapshot of the kinds of things that we already interact with. But we do face quite a few challenges. For instance, accuracy and skewed results, certainly here at my own institution, UHI, with the amount of campuses that we have and the different locations that we have and just the nature of our setup, really, it can really be a problem with us in terms of skewed results, particularly because sometimes we're dealing with quite small student cohorts, so we have to be quite careful about how we assess our data. I think that everyone also suffers with survey fatigue, low response rates, and that tick box effect where, students disengage throughout the survey process and they just tick random boxes. I think a really important question and a challenge that we face is also, are we measuring the right areas in relation to the student experience, particularly in terms of KPIs, which are very, very important. There's next to no student involvement with those, but how do we know that we're measuring the right areas in terms of the student experience? Do our students care about KPIs? And more importantly, they should, and I think that we really need to start embedding that in practice. And should we be measuring ourselves based on student perspectives and standards? I think that KPIs are quite interesting because they direct our focus to particular areas, but at the same time, without student input, could our focus be getting misdirected to the areas that engage students the least? Other challenges that we face are the competitive nature of data. So sometimes it can cause us as a sector to compete with one another rather than to work collectively for the good of the student experience. And also we're quite inside the box. It's very quantitative versus qualitative, and I think there's a heavy reliance particularly on quantitative data, and I think that as a sector at the minute there's a bit of a shift to try and look at what other kinds of data could we be looking at that would be beneficial. Another point to note is that a challenge with quantitative data is that it can be quite easily manipulated, and you don't necessarily get the full picture without the information to back up the statistics, but it can also be quite difficult to capture qualitative data. And yet, survey fatigue. So there are quite literally surveys everywhere. We try to use surveys for everything, and this can be quite overwhelming for students, particularly at certain times of the year. In terms of barriers for the students engaging, as I've mentioned, survey fatigue is definitely one of them, but there's also a serious lack of understanding and awareness. There's also a lot of apathy from students, I think, and are we really explaining to students how important the data collected is and how it can help to shape change? I think that the less involved students are, the less that they're going to care about the outcome. Skill levels can vary across the board, and that's not, any kind of comment on a particular individual. I find it quite difficult to interact with data processes sometimes, and I've had a lot of support, I think, through just working in the Students' Association and having to interact with data on a day-to-day basis. So I'm really in a slightly different position from just student representatives in classrooms or on the ground. And there is generally a lack of support available to try and get students to that skill level that they would need to interact confidently with data processes. Ethics, I think that that's a rising issue for us, particularly with all of the GDPR things that have come into effect over the past couple of years. And it can be quite a tricky barrier, particularly if we're dealing with things like welfare data. But I think at the same time, there's a lot of opportunities available for students engaging with data processes. If they understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, they're more likely to meaningfully engage and to help us. The more that they understand, then the more ownership that they can have, and that should increase student buy-in. So the more that students understand the importance, the more engaged they'll be and support those survey processes or help us to kind of get past the challenges that we face. Also, students are the experts on the student experience, learning or otherwise, and so they can really help us to understand which bits are the most important to measure. And quite often, whilst they help us to identify the issues, do we go back to them and get them to help us to shape the solutions? And I think that there's some really good good practice developing, in the sector at the minute. And I think that this is really going to increase. With better support for students in our data processes, we can have more meaningful dialogues with our institutions and with those students. They can help us to gather more meaningful statistics, which can be bolstered by that qualitative data, which students are probably more likely to provide if they have an understanding of why we're trying to capture it. And if we embed student support in our data processes, then student reps can support other students to meaningfully engage and can help other student reps in that process. And lastly, I think that, again, as I've already said, students I think should have more ownership over KPIs. If we're measuring how good we are improving the student experience, then I think that students should absolutely help us to shape what this looks like. So the case study that I wanted to present today is the HISA Student Rep Summit. For quite a long time, I had wanted to put on an event with my Students' Association and in partnership with the university, which focused on the student reps. And when I came into this role with the Students' Association and I began to interact with enhancement themes, that really gave us the opportunity to try and do something like that. So this was quite heavily tied into our enhancement themes project here at the university. For us, it was the first event of its type. There was quite a lot of feeling around and seeing how we could do this and scoping out how we could make data an engaging thing for students, because it can be quite a dull thing to try and engage with for staff and students alike. As I mentioned, it was jointly organised between HISA and the university, but more specifically our Learning and Teaching Academy, and I think that that was a fantastic partnership and really the right people that should be involved in an event like this. So it completely focused on the student reps, alongside looking at data and how we could get them more involved in our processes. We really wanted to be able to celebrate the role of the student representative and to promote the value of it, because for us, particularly in an organisation of our nature where we're quite scattered geographically and we're dealing with varying student numbers and we have a very wide range of different types of student, they're a very crucial link for us, particularly in terms of communication with the students. Staff were invited to the event as well, and that was to really try and aid communication with the student reps and to establish more of a working relationship there. Not to say that it was a bad relationship by any stretch, but just to try and bolster it, because, as I mentioned, our geographic nature can make it quite difficult for that communication to take place at times. So we had a number of sessions. It was a full day event, and we had a number of sessions which, as I said, promoted value around the student rep role, looked at increasing communication between staff and student reps, but really the main driver and the main focus for us was trying to get them more involved in our data processes. So I would just like to briefly take you through the sessions that we ran that day. So the first one was KPIs, who gives a fork, and that was really to try and get students more active and involved in our KPI processes. We took them through what KPIs were, we explained their importance and how heavily we rely upon them, both from the point of view of the Students' Association and from the point of view of the university. We then led an activity which the aim of that activity was to try and get the students to help us shape KPIs that we could then take on in the next year, so that we could really say that we were measuring ourselves to the student standards, particularly around things like the student experience. To try and make that session more engaging, the way that we operated it was that we asked them to pick 10 areas of how HISA operates, or the work that we carry out, which were most important to them as students. We then went back and asked them to give us 10 ways that we could measure how well we were doing in those areas, and they had to use multicolored plastic forks to kind of establish a metric for how important they thought these things were. And it seemed to work really well. We did come away with KPIs, and HISA are implementing some of those in our strategic plan, our operational plan from next year onwards, and that will keep getting fed back to the students about where we've put those and how we're looking at them. We also had a session on engagement indicators, which was a World Cafe session, and that was really looking at how we kind of measure engagement from students in a number of areas, and we asked them to look through these with us and to help us to come up with other ways that we could measure engagement, because are we getting it right? I believe one of the questions that we posed on the day was that is looking at sort of engagement indicators from things like your virtual learning environment, you know, how many times a student has logged on or how much time they've spent on there. Is that actually accurate, or could we look at more meaningful indicators? So again, we came back with some wonderful data from that, and we're going to be looking at how we can use those indicators that the students helped us to come up with moving forwards. The next session was particularly about student representation and the perception of that. And that was really quite an interesting session. In order to try and make the whole event more fun, we tried to embed things like arts and crafts or hands-on activities in most of the sessions. So for this session, students had access to a range of arts and crafts supplies, and in their groups, we asked them to create perception posters, and we gave them buzzwords to do with student representation, and we really wanted them to create posters which captured how they viewed the role of student rep in certain areas. And that was quite interesting, because it didn't always go the way that you kind of maybe expected it to. During that session, we also we put the staff specifically on one table who had attended the event, and we got them to carry out the same activity. And that was really interesting as well, to kind of be able to compare those posters and the perceptions behind those. And I think that really actually that session, when we came away from the event, it had given us some really interesting qualitative data. And also Another sort of output from that is that being able to take those perceptions of the student rep role and how much they value that role and the importance that they see, we can really use that information to try and promote that role next year to new students and to try and increase engagement throughout the university with our student rep systems. Moving on to student surveys, who cares? We do. Referring back to the apathy I mentioned at the start, we really wanted to try and get the student reps more engaged with the different surveys that we run at our university. So this session was looking at who cares about the survey, why they might not care, and what the barriers are there to, or what causes disengagement from those, and why you should care. And we wanted them to help us to shape ways that we could engage students better in the student survey processes. So they were asked to draw mind maps, again using their arts and crafts supplies just on flip chart paper, and to come up with ideas about how to promote the surveys better to all of our students, not necessarily just the traditional student that's in a classroom. For instance, we have a lot of online and network students, so how do we promote it to them and engage them? And they really helped us to kind of look at new ways to try and get students engaged with our surveys and to try and overcome that apathy so that the data that we're getting back is even more meaningful. Again, the next session you said we did, at the minute there's quite a lot of discussion, I think, in the HE sector about whether or not this method of closing the feedback loop actually works. And I think that a number of institutions are actually looking at how they can change this and make it a better system in order to really feed back to students about what we're getting up to with the feedback that they give us. So we were attempting to try and engage students in helping us to come up with a new system which would be better at closing the feedback loop, but which would go further than just feeding back to them and which would be more, I suppose, ongoing and live. At the minute, I think one of the challenges that we face with You Said We Did is that it's quite static and that it seems to kind of almost cut off at that point where you feed back to the students about what you've done with the information that they've given you. But what we really want to see is a system that goes past that and where we go back to the students with what we've done and ask them, you know, is this the right thing? Did you envisage that we would do something else? Did you have a suggestion? And getting them to help us take ownership of that process and to look at the solutions to the problems identified and also to celebrate great practice. Then the last session, student representation, getting it right for online and networked students. At UHI, we have quite a high number of online and networked students, and whilst we already face challenges in terms of student representation with regards to geographical barriers and things like that, we also have challenges that we face engaging online and networked students in student representation. So we basically, in their groups, they just discussed how we could make this more accessible to those kinds of students. And there was a number of online and networked students who attended the event, and it was fantastic to have them participate in those discussions because they were really able to help us to identify the challenges and also to give us some really, really great information about what works for them and how we can take that and expand it and try and engage even more online and networked students in student representation. So the entire event throughout the day, each session, even though it maybe didn't feel like it at the time, every session captured different kinds of data. And I think when we came together after the event, we were really quite overwhelmed by what we'd managed to capture. And that's a really good problem to have. So I think we found it really, really successful. And we tried to think throughout the day of ways that we could do things differently, ways that we could make things fun, ways that we could make things engaging for those students, and ways that we could make data just more accessible and interesting. even at the end, whenever we wanted to gather feedback, we decided not to have feedback forms. We felt that, feedback forms are great, but quite often at events, you get given them at the end of the day. You can't necessarily remember all of the things that you thought about throughout the day. You kind of just want to leave maybe and go home. So you don't often get a great response to feedback forms. So instead, we bought some paper tablecloths and we put them on each of the tables, and we asked them to write down any thoughts that they had about anything and everything they were up to throughout the day instantly, just as soon as they thought about it. And again, that seems to have worked really, really well, and we've come back with some fantastic feedback about the sessions that we ran, and what they thought worked, what they thought didn't work. And we also got some great artwork, which was quite interesting. So overall, yes, I think that our event was very successful, and it will be really interesting to see what we can do with all of the data that we've gathered. And we've already started to look at implementing some of the things like the KPI suggestions and the engagement indicators ahead of next year. And I think moving on, although I'm actually stepping down from this role, Highzen UHI will continue to look at this as part of the enhancement themes over the course of the next year. And we've already been discussing amongst ourselves how could we, take what we did with this event and our projects overall with enhancement themes, and what would we do in year 3. And I think that one of the things that we're toying with as an idea is maybe looking at developing a toolkit for our students. So I'll be very excited to see how that gets taken forward next year. So I think what I'd like to close with is there's some things I think that we should consider, and questions that I think that maybe we should try and think about moving forwards. Are we meaningfully engaging our students in our data processes? How far are we going in terms of trying to engage them? And is there more that we could do? Should we be considering other data sets? Do we need to start to look at other, maybe not so traditional forms of data? At the minute, there's a shift. A lot of people are beginning to look at social media data for an indicator of student engagement, for instance. But I think that, there's a lot more out there that we maybe haven't considered just yet. And lastly, should we be thinking about other data collection methods and moving away from those traditional processes as well? So I think that they're just some interesting questions to maybe consider or bear in mind. That's the end of my presentation, so thank you very much for listening. I'll just hand it back to William now in case anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Sorcha. That was really, really interesting. We don't have, obviously, the mics open as we mentioned at the start, but if anyone has a question or a comment, please do submit it in the box to the left of your screen. I'll kick us off with one though, Sorcha. That was fascinating, and I'm really interested in the kind of model that you've developed, a model of engaging students and working with data, because it's not just a series of individual kind of activities. It's actually a well thought out way of approaching things. And I'm wondering, when you take the actions emerging from that to institutional staff, to colleagues in the Students' Association, is it received differently because of that methodology or that way of doing things? Is it given more credence or more weight because it's been gathered in a particular way?
I'm not entirely sure. I think because we'd been working towards this event and we'd really, as I say, tried to kind of embed fun in everything. There was quite a running joke at the time about me being the fun police. Everybody was sort of looking forwards to it, and I think already intrigued by what might come out of it. I think the fact that it was attached to enhancement themes gave it more credence. potentially, more amongst the university staff. But I think everybody was really engaged and quite excited to see what kind of data we could gather in the day, because at the time as well, this was the first time that we'd done it. So we were a little bit nervous. We didn't actually know how well it would go, but we really wanted to try this out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, my suspicion is that it would be given more weight by staff, just because when I look at it and I think about the thought process that went into putting it together and thinking through what you really need to communicate to staff about how students engage with the data and the way you've gone about gathering it, it seems to me that it would be received differently. But it'd be interesting to see if that actually bears out. We have a question in the chat box, Sorcha, if you want to pick up on that. Are you able to see it okay, from Karen?
Yes, yeah, I can see it. So, yes, the World Cafe, sorry, I probably should have explained it slightly more. That session, I supported that session, and that was actually led by one of our LTA colleagues, Keith Smythe. So what Keith did was, because we had all of the attendees in groups around different tables, and he asked the groups to basically, after presenting to them about what engagement indicators we traditionally look at, he asked them to come up with some. And after a period of time when they'd kind of discussed that in their group and written these down on their flip chart pads, he then asked all of the tables to get up and to move, I think it was left one, so they actually went to a different table. And then they were asked to review the engagement indicators that other group had come up with, and I think they were ranked out of 10. So that was quite interesting. And I think it's called a World Cafe because it's like you're moving it around. So Keith was very much the lead on that session, and it seemed to work very well. I hope I've explained that enough.
No, I think that's a fair explanation, Sorcha. Sometimes that technique's referred to as carouseling as well, when you move around in a circle to kind of review other people's work. But I think it's a useful way to get a view from across the body who are present. That's quite useful. I have another question, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm really interested in so you've developed a model of doing this, and it looks like it's been very successful. But to get buy-in from staff requires probably at least two things. One is their understanding of what it is you want and what it is you need, and the other is the kind of the delivery of that support. So what I'm wondering is if you have any thoughts on what practically you would need from an institution to get some of these things going, and who in institutions might be the kind of key people to go to. So is it the people who work in the planning department? Is it the people who work in the quality office? Is it kind of institutional staff who do learning and teaching stuff? Is it all of those? Is it somebody entirely different? So that's what I'm kind of interested in, what it is you need from the institution and who's the person or the people, the groups that are going to give you that.
I think that might vary institution to institution. We have a slightly different makeup from a lot of other institutions, and we're tertiary as well. Sorry, something I should have pointed out was that we had both higher education and further education student reps and staff in attendance at this event. I think we're really lucky though, because at my institution it certainly is very clear to me that most of our staff are, very engaged with the student reps and do value them, but there are obviously pockets where we would like to see that improve. And I think that was really important, and that we really tried to embed that during this event. But I think that really helped us with staff buy-in to the event and staff attendance. So we did have a number of senior management staff who attended, and it was fantastic to see them attend, because that really sort of fosters, I think, engagement with other staff members. In terms of making it work and the kinds of staff that I think are important to engage in this kind of work, I think quality teams are very important, and we certainly do work quite closely with our own quality teams, and they're quite active with the student reps, so I think that that really helps. We also have a number of student engagement staff, and I think that they're really important as well. I think my answer to that question would really be everybody. I think that all staff members should engage with student representatives, and I think that it should be important to all staff members to do so, and that there's value there regardless of what your role is. Student engagement should be at the heart of everything, and I think that it also, you know, helps staff with the work that they're trying to do, whatever it is that they're trying to do, to try and have student reps engaged in that. But I think absolutely quality teams, senior management and student engagement staff are particularly important, and also programme leaders.
That's really helpful, Sorcha. Thank you. We have another question in the box, if you're able to see that and answer it for us, Sorcha.
Yeah. I mean, throughout the event, we tried to highlight the importance of data to those students who attended. We obviously want to widen this and make it a dialogue that's happening everywhere, that's happening on the ground. And I think that actually the student reps who attended the event on the day are key to this, because they're going away and they're speaking to the students in their class, they're speaking to other student reps who maybe couldn't attend, and they're really promoting that message. And I think that some of the feedback that we received actually from the event was particularly interesting, and it was comments about, you know, how they hadn't realised something was so important before, and now they really understand it and they want to engage with it further and things like that. So I don't think it's necessarily just a piece of work. I think that it's something that we need to embed is sort of promoting that value and the importance of the data to the students. I think that in terms of this enhancement themes project, that will be taken forward maybe as a piece of work and about promoting that value to students. Unfortunately, as I say, I have to step down from my role, so I won't be involved in the next phase. But I think that that work has already started, if that makes sense, and it started at this event, and I think that it has continued from them.
Sorcha, thanks for that response again. What I wonder is, just as we're drawing towards a close, I wonder if there are any kind of key principles you might want to draw out that kind of underpin the work you've been doing. I'm just thinking about the kind of high level stuff that people need to keep in mind when they're thinking about adapting something like this or designing something similar. Is that something you feel like you could reflect on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think partnership is one of the most important values. I think any work in this area, the way for it to be most successful is for it to be a partnership between whoever your student representatives are, like maybe your students association, and also your institutional staff, because from the Students' Association side of things, that promotes buy-in for students, and the flip side of that is that staff are engaged, and that's promoting staff buy-in and value of the student voice. I think particularly whenever you're trying to do something like this, or to get students engaged in the way that we did, it sounds bizarre, but I think fun has to be a core principle to it, because if it isn't engaging and interesting and fun to the students, then they just disengage. So I think that those are two of the most important principles. And I just think inclusivity and accessibility, whatever you can do with the work that you're carrying out in this area to make it more accessible to the students you want to get involved, and as inclusive as possible so that you're capturing a wide range of students, I think that that's absolutely crucial.
Again, Sorcha, thank you very much for that series of reflections. I think particularly the idea of having fun at the heart of this is really important, and such an easy thing to overlook or to assume that it'll either just happen or it won't, but actually thinking about how you build it in and how you make it a kind of core element of what you're delivering and how you're engaging people